It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Christopher Johns, the Norman and Rosalia Goldberg Professor of History of Art at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he also serves as chair of the department. He received his BA in the History of Art summa cum laude from Florida State University and his PhD from the University of Delaware. He is the author of 2 books, Papal Art and Cultural Politics, Rome in the Age of Clement XI, and Antonio Canova and the Politics of Patronage in Revolutionary and Napoleonic Europe. He has received fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study in Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and Downing College at the University of Cambridge, as well as the American Academy in Rome, where he was resident in art history in 2004. Today, his lecture is entitled, Which Antiquity? Politics and Taste in Bonapartist Visual Culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Johns.
Get set up here. Okay. Thank you very much, Ron, and I'm very delighted to be here. Although a native Southerner, I've never been to the High Museum, and it's just a fantastic building with a wonderful collection, and the exhibitions, of course, are just really, for me, especially wonderful. So I thank you for the invitation to come. Could we have the lights down, please? Before specifically addressing questions of the role of antiquity in the architectural and art patronage of Josephine and Napoleon, I think it's an important thing to ask in the beginning, what did the term antiquity actually mean to people at the end of the 18th century? And I'd like to talk about this in sort of 2 ways. There are essentially 2 types, I think. Greco-Roman antiquity, which is the one with which we're most familiar, and Greco-Roman antiquity has 2 major facets. I'm showing you now the public facet of Greco-Roman antiquity in the consular period and the empire in France in the first years of the 19th century. At the left, you see a very famous Roman monument that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the Arch of Constantine, erected in Rome near the Colosseum. In the early part of the 4th century. You see it has 3 major opening sculptural details. This becomes, in the empire, in France, the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel near the Louvre. So the form is quite directly emulated by Percier and Fontaine, an architectural design firm and builder that we'll hear more about in due course. The arch on the right dates from 1806 to 1808 and was meant to be the public face in terms of visual monuments to Napoleonic victories over the Austrians and Prussians at battles like Austerlitz and Jena. So the public sphere for Greco-Roman antiquity in forms like the Arc de Triomphe over here on the right basically helps to define the nature of authority in this society. If you're looking for dynastic and institutional continuity, individual aggrandizement, or simply an expression of the raw power of the state, Greco-Roman antiquity was what you would choose basically as the default style for those kinds of ideas. There's also, however, a private aspect to Greco-Roman antiquity as it's inflected in the visual arts in this era. And this was tremendously aided by the excavations at Herculaneum and Pompeii in the area around Naples in southern Italy, beginning in 1739 and continuing, well, in fact, they're still continuing, but certainly this completely revolutionized the whole idea about the ancient world at the end of the 18th century. The thing that's remarkable about Pompeii and Herculaneum is that for the first time there was an extensive understanding of private life, of provincial civilization in the Roman Empire. until the Vesuvian unpleasantness of 79 AD sort of put an end to all of that. But look into Roman interiors, Roman furniture, beautifully preserved, in addition to some of the wall paintings that were widely influential through prints and engravings that were disseminated all over Europe. I'm showing you a famous example that many of you probably seen. It's one of the Dionysian ritual initiations from the Villa of the Mysteries. This dates about 100 years before Vesuvius. And I'm showing you at left a French painting executed in 1763 by a famous artist, Joseph-Marie Vienne. Vienne was David's teacher. And in this work on the left, and I can't prove this to you, but take my word for it, it's based on a reversed image of a Pompeian wall painting. The title is The Vendor of Cupids, and in particular, this kind of intimate, private sphere form of Greco-Roman antiquity had tremendous impact on furniture, on design, as you can see in the exhibition everywhere, and certainly on the kind of intimate eroticism and feminization of this kind of private sphere art. The theme is a Roman lady seated here in chairs with all sorts of architectural details that you'll hear more about in the second lecture, and decorative objects. She's receiving, along with one of her friends here, a servant who's selling cupids out of a little basket. The frivolity and the sort of gentle eroticism of the theme are quite remarkable, and those of you who have actually seen Pompeian originals are aware of the kind of, shall we say, sketchy nature of a lot of those kinds of eroticized wall paintings. In fact, if you look carefully at the gesture of Cupid here, you can see in this sort of gentle reaction to it that the vendor, the lady selling it, is showing you just how much love is on offer. A rival to Greco-Roman antiquity, perhaps lesser known in the context of certainly of decorative arts, but very important for literature and for broader movements in visual culture, is the second type of antiquity I'd like to talk about, and that is Nordic antiquity. This was essentially invented in the 18th century by a Scottish Presbyterian minister named James Macpherson, who claimed to have discovered fragmentary manuscripts in various caves in the Scottish Highlands that were purported to be the written down poetry of an oral bard named Ossian, who functioned and played as lyre and was blind just like the Mediterranean Homer in the northern Highlands of Scotland. These works were published in various forms under the generic title of Ossian, and they were translated almost immediately into every major European language. What Ossian was, in addition to being largely a fraud, was the idea that Northern Europe, at this point, by the end of the 18th century, economically powerful, colonializing, but still feeling cultural inferior to the Latinate Mediterranean world because they had no Homer, they had no Vitruvius, they had no Virgil, they had no Parthenon. They wanted a kind of a tradition, a cultural tradition that had the kind of pedigree that the Homeric world of Greco-Roman antiquity had. Ossian seemed to be the answer. For our purposes, Napoleon in particular was extremely taken with Ossian. It's said that he traveled with texts of Ossian when he was on campaign, that he read it every night before he went to bed, and that the whole idea of these sort of heroes of northern lore, of Valhalla, and sort of the hero's death, being rewarded with 50 maidens, all coming out of one shell, these kinds of bizarre, and it's unreadable today, these kind of bizarre stories from Ossian were inspired Napoleon and many others at the time. I'm showing you two pictures based on Ossianic texts that were commissioned by Napoleon and Josephine for Malmaison and are still there. At the right is a painting by François Gérard from 1801 called Ossian Playing His Lyre. Here you see the bard with his lyre here in sort of in shadow, and it's conjured up a vision of one of his heroes, Fingal, and sort of various other types of characters. The men look vaguely militaristic, the women look quite pliable and available, and the whole idea of the moon, eclipses, fogs, mists and vapors, this kind of oceanic Nordic antique world is basically more about nature than it is about culture, and this is an extremely important difference with Greco-Roman antiquity, which is much more about culture than nature. The forces of nature, the power of, and when you read the text, it's just every other line, there's some huge snowstorm that wipes out a whole tribe of people. It's like The Hobbit or something. And, there are earthquakes and lightning bolts and, blinding sleet storms. In other words, weather is the major protagonist. And this, of course, ties it very intimately into the emerging romantic tradition that privileges nature over the rather puny efforts of mankind. But it's the antiquity, the sort of the pedigree of this Nordic form of Ossian that's most important. And over here on the left is the more famous of the two Ossianic commissions for the Chateau de Malmaison. This is by Giraudet Triosson, also from 1801, and it shows Ossian receiving slain French heroes into Valhalla. This is the Nordic warrior's heaven. Here we see Ossian blind, like the Greek Homer, in these kind of white robes, greeting French generals slain in battle. This one particularly here is Marshal Desaix. You see his greyhound here, which was always with him. He was killed at the Battle of Marengo during the Italian campaigns. Up at the top, you see the Gallic cock, the Austrian eagle, and then this sort of sea of teeming maidens who sort of are coming up here to greet the warriors and supposedly be their companions and all of that. My point in showing this one in particular is to stress the notion of natural fecundity. Ossian, when a warrior and a maiden mate in Ossian, you don't have one child or even quintuplets. It's like 100, sort of usher forth, populating the world. This romantic principle of fecundity is something that we're going to see in a very different context in a few minutes. But I want to call it to your attention at this point because it is part of this Nordic antique tradition that I think was not only important to the public face of a Napoleonic visual propaganda, but I think it was also important for the private sphere as well. And in addition to the two types of antiquity I've been talking about, the Greco-Roman and then now the Nordic, I'd like to put in a complicating factor that was emerging by the 1780s in France and elsewhere, and that's the idea of medieval. The medieval revival of the end of the 18th century that has tremendous impetus throughout the 19th and arguably still around today when you look at a lot of churches and public buildings built in Gothic revival, college campuses, etc. Specific for my argument to this medievalizing idea is a specific facet of it that's called the troubadour style or the troubadour movement. Troubadours were high medieval bards, players who went from town to town making musical performances, reciting poetry under ladies' windows. And the early 19th century, and particularly Josephine, was taken with the kind of the romance of it all. The troubadour movement in its new form in the 19th century was based visually on manuscript illumination and miniature painting. This is the visual sources for a lot of this type of art. And I'm showing you one example of this on the left. Remember, slides always distort scale. This picture is only about this big. It's not large at all. So when you look at it, you have to go close to it and see it and study the sort of intimate details of it. It's a miniaturist type of style, and indeed that was the visual inspiration for it. This particular work that I'm showing you was not in Josephine's collection at Malmaison, although she owned over 20 troubadour and troubadour-related paintings. But the artist of the title of this, by the way, is The Tournament. You can see it's a joust going on here between two heroes, easily identified by their armorial markings. It dates 1812, and it's by an artist named Pierre-Henri Revoil, who was in Josephine's collection with at least 5 paintings. So this is exactly the kind of thing in which she was interested. This kind of private, eroticized, but in a positive sense, eroticized vision of the Middle Ages had a nationalistic overtone because the troubadour style was associated particularly with France. Okay, we've got now 3 forms of cultural authority. The Greco-Roman, both public and private, which is the common language of European high culture, the Greco-Roman world. You've got this Nordic rival to it in the form of Ocean, which is clearly a result of a cultural inferiority complex of Northern Europe vis-a-vis the Mediterranean Latinate world. And now you've got this specifically French nationalistic form seen in troubadour art. But it's often very hard to understand when you're trying to create these sorts of categories how these works blended together. And Malmaison is the perfect example of how that happens. And the tension between these things can be seen, I think, very nicely with this comparison. The painting on the right is a portrait of Josephine that was executed in Italy during the Italian campaigns in 1796 by the Milanese artist Andrea Appiani. Appiani made numerous portraits of Napoleon and was absolutely Napoleon's favorite painter. David usually is given this title, but Appiani was much more malleable and pliable than David was, who was often very difficult to work with because he often asked to be paid for the things he did, and this distressed Napoleon from time to time, and certainly his household. But the classicism of this, where she's in this almost neo-Rococo idea of the beautiful lady crowning Venus, and you have the sort of the antique style statue, the Mediterranean world, the sort of the Campania type of background, the sort of nice costume here, this sort of elegant, restrained simplicity that is very much like the Greco-Roman model, juxtaposed to this sort of tournament style of medievalism. The connecting factor is the feminine, the idea that tournaments are fought for the honor of a lady or for the benefit of a lady in this kind of chivalric system. This is also another kind of sort of appeal to feminine grace, delicacy, and sensibility seen in from a different kind of cultural context. I'd like now to turn specifically to Malmaison. And to talk about Josephine and Napoleon's collecting practices and their taste in this context, which is both private and semi-public. By that I mean that the official residence of Napoleon and Josephine after the consular period, and certainly during the Empire after 1804, was the Tuileries Palace in Paris, next door to where the Louvre is now. This was torn down later in the 19th century. And now is the Tuileries Gardens, but that was the official residence of Napoleon and Josephine. Malmaison was more of a villa, sort of suburban retreat, far enough from Paris to be out of the bad air and the crowds and the noise, but close enough in order to allow Napoleon to basically commute into work, at least when he was in Paris. But certainly at Malmaison, a number of important visitors were entertained, both diplomatic, political, and otherwise. So there's never the idea that Malmaison is a completely removed area, so you can't speak specifically of the private sphere exclusively. There is a semi-public aspect to it. But at the same time, there are certain parts of the chateau that were very much private rooms and private space. So this semi-public versus private plays beautifully in various interiors at Malmaison. This chateau was in a dilapidated state when it was purchased by Napoleon and Josephine right at the end of the 18th century, about the time that Napoleon was getting back from the Egyptian campaigns at the end of the century and just before the coup that brought him into dictatorial power. Percier and Fontaine, the architects of the Arc de Triomphe de Carousel that I showed you just a few minutes ago, were employed to basically renovate the interiors of the chateau, and then an army of landscapists and landscape architects were hired to work on the extensive gardens, almost all of which is gone now. The chateau is still there, but the gardens are nothing like they were in Josephine's time. The gardens, though, in the early 19th century were the most famous part of the whole complex, and people were allowed to walk there on Sunday afternoons. It had a more public face, and I'm showing you exterior views of the chateau as it looks now at the right, but an 18th century watercolor showing you some of the works going back to into the gardens with these sort of potted trees. There was an orangerie, a greenhouse. They grew all sorts of exotic fruits and vegetables. She was particularly interested in horticulture. The Josephine rose was basically bred and is a hybrid and achieved European fame. exactly in these gardens. So I think that in some ways this shows you kind of a more lived space than this kind of isolated monument of the modern view that we see over here on the right. I'd like to fairly quickly go through a number of the interiors, but first I want to show you the painting on the left, which is the most famous portrait of Josephine meditating in her gardens at Malmaison. It's by the painter Pierre-Paul Prudhon, dates 1805. You see her here with very few references to her rank. She's dressed, believe it or not, quite simply, with a cashmere shawl, seated by a little stream. We see crepuscular lighting in the background, simple urns on garden walls, and she seems absolutely lost in a kind of a romantic reverie. From what we know about Josephine's personal taste, this is much more the type of image that she liked. I mean, she commissioned this and paid for it out of her own purse. And so we, I think, can make the assumption that this is how she wanted her sort of sensibilities to be visualized in a portrait of this type. This doesn't have the kind of public, formal, even dynastic stature of many of the other portraits of Josephine, and we'll see a couple of those in due course. The work on the right is an interior view of the library. We're going to be hearing a lot more about specific details of furniture and other types of objects in these interiors. So I want to just point out a very few things that I think are interesting to note. If you look up at the top, you see an almost trellis type of form of garlands and various types of swags. These types of decorations, both in the ceiling and wallpaper and other places, tend to be reserved for spaces that were occupied largely by Josephine. We don't see them to nearly the same degree, for instance, in the emperor's bedroom that I'm going to show you in just a moment, and in other places. In other words, this kind of natural vegetation and growth inspired by the grotesque tradition from antiquity, tends to be associated more with the feminine and more with Josephine's natural taste. Here are the two bedrooms, and again, I'm not going to go into great detail, but make just a couple of points about these kinds of spaces and the gendering of these types of very private spaces. On the left is the emperor's bedroom, and you can see the kind of the scientific, more masculine world of culture. You have a tripod here that's done in an empire-style tripod that's based on antique forms, and you can see these very clearly, both ancient and modern exemplars of it in the exhibition. And the camp bed, this sort of very formal type of bed that reminds you of, for instance, the bed of the Emperor Constantine in Piero della Francesca's famous frescoes. This is a masculine type of bed form. Over here on the right in the Empress's bedroom, you see the same style, but it's much sort of smaller and more reduced. But I call your attention specifically to this image that is embroidered into the rug here, or woven into the rug of the swan, which was one of Josephine's major signifiers. Two more of the interiors. On the right is the dining room, and on the left is the salon. And I bring this one in particularly to show you where Ossian, the Ossian painting of Girodet is. Still in situ next to a portrait of Napoleon. This is the dead French heroes being greeted by Ossian in Valhalla. And you can see other details of the furniture that are very much inspired by both Pompeian and the sort of the empire interpretation of ancient furniture forms. And over here on the right, in the dining room, I call your attention specifically to these figures on the panels here on either side, which look remarkably like the muses that you can see in the exhibition that are actually Pompeian wall paintings. And one view over here, again, a contemporary image, a watercolor showing part of the gallery and the conservatory. And this figure of Cupid here by the artist Francois Bolsio was a work of art that Josephine actually commissioned. I say that because, generally speaking, most of the art at Malmaison and in Josephine's personal collection was not commissioned. These were presents, people who understood her taste, wished to curry her favor. She liked presents a lot, and particularly important jewelry, often things that had been pried out of chalices and papal tiaras and other forms of ecclesiastical furniture, reconfigured into the secular complex for the adornment of the empress. She liked these kinds of things very much. But she had gone to the Salon in Paris and had seen the model for this on display there and commissioned a marble version of it. And this is what you see the people sort of here admiring in this way. All of these sculptures in this area of the chateau were replaced by Canovas. This remained in the collection, but were replaced by important works by Canova that I'll talk about at the very end. And over here on the left, some of you may already recognize this because it's blown up in color in a mural in the exhibition. This is a painting of the music room during Josephine's lifetime. You can see how paintings were actually displayed more because of their size than because of their subjects and interesting juxtapositions. Over here on the left, you see a couple of troubadour paintings on either side of this larger one. But I specifically call your attention to this sort of room here, which is the room we're looking at here. This is a little hard to see, but right here and right here, you can see two of the Canovas that are sort of veiled through this kind of diaphanous drapery. But when you look at the blown-up version of it in the exhibition, these become much, much clearer. So the music room that leads into to the gallery, where Canova's really matchless, peerless collection of Canova statues was located. I'd like to move from the private and sort of semi-public space of Malmaison to the much more public face of Napoleonic propaganda that involves Josephine and some of the principles of both Greco-Roman, Nordic antiquity, and troubadour style that I've talked about throughout. The picture we're looking at now, of course, many of you know, is by Jacques-Louis David. It was the major Napoleonic commission of his career. And it's the Coronation of Josephine, also called Le Sacre, dates from 1804 to 1808. It was commissioned as a part of a series of 4 monumental, truly monumental canvases to commemorate the instauration of the empire in 1804, its establishment. There were 4 of these scenes commissioned. Only one other one was actually completed. One of the reasons why is that David, they're huge pictures and, of course, a lot of effort, and David was having so much trouble getting his money for the work that he had been doing that he worked very, very slowly. So 2 of the works are only known in the form of drawings and preliminary designs. 2 of the pictures are actually finished. This is the moment in which Napoleon and Josephine were crowned as Emperor and Empress of France. That is, moving from the consular period, which was a kind of a fictive military dictatorship, into this more dynastic sensibility of the empire, where the right to govern would pass through the body of the empress to an heir, and that in the old style, where dynasty is actually emphasized in that way. The Greco-Roman part of this, of course, many of you, I'm sure, have been to Notre Dame in Paris and understand that it's a Gothic structure from the Middle Ages. But you would never know that to look at the set. This is the area around the chancel in the high altar over here. It's been completely camouflaged by Romanizing classical architecture, again, festival architecture designed by Percier and Fontaine to disguise, literally disguise, the actual architecture of this area of the cathedral. The reason why, we've seen troubadours, you would think, well, medieval, they would like this. But in point of fact, Gothic in particular was so strongly associated with the Bourbon dynasty of his predecessors, Louis XVI, XV, XIV, XIII, Henry IV, because those kings were habitually crowned at Rheims Cathedral in northeastern France, which is a Gothic structure. So the sort of the Gothic alliance of the Catholic Church, of the French monarchy, the coronations in this Gothic space at Rheims, This was something that Napoleon wanted to avoid. He wanted a new form, not a kingdom, but he wanted an empire based on sort of classical ideas, at least in this context, not Gothic ones. So the Gothic literally was excluded from consideration because of its political associations with the Bourbons. The Nordic, which is much less obvious, the Nordic antique associations with this, I think, are more subtle, but absolutely are as important as the kind of more Roman ideas that are usually talked about in association with this painting. If you look, here's Josephine, and a detail over here on the left. Napoleon is already crowned and is about to put the crown on Josephine's head, who kneels here. She's already wearing a diadem to receive it. The idea of natural fecundity is absolutely in play here, and the ability of the female body to continue a dynasty. It's the one thing that men can't do themselves. They can conquer territories, they can establish laws, they can do all of these things, but if you have a dynasty, the one thing that's absolutely essential is a wife, a legitimate wife, who can produce an heir to to those titles. This is something that's important to this idea, and it's one of the reasons I think why Josephine is front and center. If you think back to the Ocean receiving the dead French heroes and all these maidens sort of swimming up out of the river of fog and mist and all of that, the fecundity of nature in this romantic sense, that's something I think that's in play here as well. For one thing, it helps to explain the huge numbers of figures in the painting. Behind Josephine, you see some of Napoleon's sisters here in the entourage, and then anchoring the composition right back here at the left is Josephine's daughter by her first marriage, Hortense de Beauharnais. On the right over here is her son, Eugène. So the fact that she has produced a daughter and a son that bracket this whole entourage of Bonaparte family members, I think is something that proves that she can bear children. Although she and Napoleon had been married, well, less than 10 years at this point, and she was well into her 30s and had not produced a child with him, still the propaganda of hope based on dynastic principles is absolutely, I think, in evidence. The other part of this that has this sort of Nordic idea of fertility and female fecundity is due to the figure that we see here. This is Napoleon's mother, Madame Mère. They didn't know what to call her because he was the first emperor of the line and she is in the previous generation, so they just called her Lady Mother. I suppose would be the best way to translate that. By all accounts, a formidable woman who argued constantly with Napoleon and who absolutely detested Josephine. As a matter of fact, she was squabbling with Napoleon at the time of the coronation. She was down in Rome. She had been summoned back for it, and she dawdled along the way long enough to actually not be present at the actual coronation. She got there a little bit late, and it was, of course, done with malice aforethought. But it's so important in this kind of sense of female fertility and dynasty to have her there. Most scholars have pointed this out as saying, well, Napoleon wants her there to legitimate his own birth and all that, and to sort of show that he and his brothers and sisters, and there are lots of them, it is an Italian family, we shouldn't forget that. Anyway, there are lots of them. She has to be there, according to the traditional argument, for that particular reason. But I think it's no accident that she's sort of put here in this sort of opera box, very prominent. She's larger in scale than the other figures. She is directly on the axis with Josephine. If the old argument were to me the only one going, wouldn't she sort of better be served being placed above Napoleon himself? This would have been easily done, and it would have moved Josephine off of the central axis. So I think that Madame Mère's fertility in terms of her numerous children and the sort of the whole Bonaparte family, I think somehow that idea is being compositionally transmitted to Josephine by her inclusion in this type of axial situation. One of the things, too, that I think helps with this particular reading is the fact that in 1817, when Napoleon was in exile on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean after Waterloo and all of that, he actually said in a letter that the moment of the painting of Josephine kneeling receiving the crown, flanked by all of these sisters-in-law and her daughter, was Josephine's idea. It wasn't Napoleon's idea or David's. And I think that must mean something. And then finally, when you look at closer up details of things like brocade, fabric, jewelry, this cameo bracelet with the likeness of Napoleon on it is taken directly from the tradition of French queens and French royal mistresses wearing cameo medallions as bracelets of the king. The most famous example is the portrait by Boucher of Madame de Pompadour in the Fogg Museum at Harvard, where she very prominently lifts her hand out so that you can see the cameo likeness of Louis XV. This is deliberately done here. But my point about the sort of the incredible detail that he shows actually has this sort of miniaturist sensibility to it that could only come, I think, from troubadour painting. David is not an active artist in this movement, but I think in a painting like this, it clearly has that kind of sensibility to it. You get a little better picture of some of the individuals involved. And as the final thing I'd like to talk about, as you know, the hopes of fecundity and the continuity of the Bonaparte dynasty through Josephine's body were, of course, frustrated. She never bore Napoleon a child. And in 1809, he decided that in order to make sure the empire survived as a Bonapartist dynasty, that he would have to remarry. And so they were divorced in 1809. She did get mad, but she didn't get everything. But she did get Malmaison and its collections as her private residence, and she got to retain her title as Empress, which also seems to have been very important to her. She died in 1814, so there were only 5 years of Josephine living by herself as a divorced woman at Malmaison. But in this particular era is when her sort of personal taste and her own impetus towards art patronage, rather than as a passive recipient of gifts and presents, she began to commission works of art and to help and was hoping to establish a reputation for herself as a learned woman, a culturally advanced woman who at Malmaison could entertain intellectuals, artists, writers, and others in the great tradition of royal mistresses at Versailles and of great Parisian society hostesses of the 18th century. She absolutely fetishized two of these women from the Ancien Regime, from the old regime, and I'm showing you portraits of both of them here. On the right, and I deliberately picked the less famous one of her sitting in a garden rather than sitting in her boudoir, is Madame de Pompadour. This was painted in 1756. And it's, I think, no accident that Madame de Pompadour was physically repudiated by Louis XV in about 1752, so she restyled herself from the royal mistress into the royal friend. And the way that she survived at court and maintained her position, one is that she maintained an amiable relationship with Louis XV, even after he was going on to younger pastors, or mixing metaphors, but traded her in for a younger model, shall we say. But she maintained a tremendously important cultural position at court by being a learned woman, promoting salon conversation, and by being an important art patron. And that was one of the models that Josephine, especially after 1809 at Malmaison, had. The other one, and this is even a greater fetish for Josephine, was Marie Antoinette, the doomed queen executed during the Terror in 1793. You see this portrait of her by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was her official court painter from about 1784-85. She so fetishized Marie Antoinette that she actually had agents go on the market and try to buy everything that had belonged to her that was available for sale, including jewelry, certain paintings that had belonged in Marie Antoinette's private collection, as well as the furniture and especially the porcelain service that she had at her sort of fantasy dairy at Rambouillet, where she and Marie, that is, and her various ladies in waiting, all of extremely high rank, would dress up as sort of little Bo Peepy looking milkmaids and pretend to churn butter and things like that because they somehow thought this was more natural. Josephine was clearly attracted to this kind of model of a female cultural patronage and authority. But it's only in her patronage of the most famous artist in Europe, and also the most expensive, Antonio Canova, that you really see Josephine exercising a type of high-level ambition as an art patron. That is someone who actually goes to an artist, discusses a commission, and then a new work of art is generated specifically for that context. Most of the antiquities, the furniture, and especially paintings and sculpture that Josephine had at Malmaison, again, were part of this passive process of receiving presents and having her ministers, representatives from the Louvre and other collections, who were actually giving her things that we assume they think they would please her. But here in her relationship with Canova, she's actively pursuing the patron-artist relationship. She commissioned, in the end, 5 works in marble sculpture, all based on mythological themes from Canova, only 4 of which she actually saw, because the 5th one was finished after her death, and I'm not going to show you that one. It's the famous 3 Graces, still in St. Petersburg. The other 4, though, were all things that appeared at Malmaison, and there seems to be some indication that by 1810, 1811, that she had hoped to turn Malmaison, partly at least, into a temple of Canova's glory. And Canova, unlike his work for Napoleon or any of Napoleon's brothers and sisters, he always worked for them unwillingly and reluctantly. He seems very much to have admired Josephine's taste and to have worked for her willingly. This is partly because she commissioned from him exactly the types of works he liked to make. Mythological works with sort of a very gentle, erotic undertone to them that had very little, if any, political signification. All Napoleon wanted were things that glorified him, portraits of himself as Mars, etc. Josephine wanted mythologies, and this is exactly the kind of sort of apolitical type of work that he liked to make and that Josephine liked to collect. Canova also hated making portraits. He despised it. He thought it was beneath his dignity as an artist, and she never asked him for a portrait either of herself, of her children, or even of Napoleon. So this must have recommended him to him very well. The first commission from Canova, and I want to talk about these very briefly, is the one on the left of a standing figure of Cupid and Psyche. This is the second version of an invention that Josephine was aware of through an engraving and from a description of her brother-in-law who had actually seen the original. So this is the second version. There are some slight variations, but it shows Psyche here as the older, sort of wiser partner in the pair. The younger Cupid comes to sort of very gently lay his head on her shoulder, and she's holding the butterfly in her hand. This is her signifier, and it references the soul, or sort of the immortality of the soul. In a sort of an 18th century sense of it, and this I think must have had something to do with Josephine's attraction to the subject, it's the female who seems to be in charge of this very gentle erotic exchange. Cupid is the more passive partner. In a lot of previous representations of this subject, Psyche's just sort of lying on a bed, having already been, and Cupid is sort of either smirking at us, as in David's painting in Cleveland, or sort of sneaking out of the room before she wakes up, sort of the typical male response after these kinds of things. Anyway, but here it's the female figure who is empowered, and I think that that's significant for a female patron. Over here on the right is the second commission. This is called a Dancer with Her Hand on Her Hip. The thing that's remarkable about this one, this was the second version of an invention Canova had already done. The one on the right is a completely original work of art. There is no antique prototype for it. It's something that Canova invented. It is certainly inspired by ancient forms, particularly wall paintings from Pompeii and other places, these sort of diaphanous muses and other nymphs dancing. Canova also hired nubile teenage girls to dance for him in his studio. It's a miracle he wasn't arrested, as Courbet was later, for sketching little naked boys on the banks of the Seine, but that's another issue. But in the Dancer with Her Hands on Her Hips, it is a completely modern invention done in an antique style, but without an antique prototype. The third is Hebe, the cupbearer of the gods. And I'm showing you here how this works in terms of a modern masterpiece of Canova sculpture that stands in juxtaposition to a female form from antiquity. This is the Capitoline Venus over here on the right from about 250 BC, and Canova's Hebe from around 1805 or so. Canova never copied antique statues, and I think this is something that Josephine and others who admired him would have appreciated. He did not imitate, he emulated. That is, he took this sort of canon of female beauty from antiquity, this statue over here on the right, and he transforms it into an image of completely feminine chic and grace. In other words, he updates the antique model rather than simply copies it or imitates it in a very direct way. I will point out one thing, too, that was criticized by many of the French classicists and others. That is the fact that he used mixed media in this. These are actually metallic objects, an opé and a drinking cup here, and you can see examples of both of these types of objects in the exhibition. So the marble statue with the mixed media cup, she is the wine, the cupbearer of the gods, was something that purists objected to. And later neoclassical artists in the 19th century, when faced with Hebe as a commission, actually would sculpt the cup and the pitcher in marble as well, to sort of get away from this kind of mixed media problem that Canova experienced. And the men should not be forgotten. On the left is the statue of Paris, commissioned by Josephine for Malmaison. This was her favorite work by Canova, and its point of antique reference, which is the Apollo Belvedere that you see here on the right from about 350 BC. And I think you can see what's happened, again, emulation rather than imitation. This stood at the center of the gallery at Malmaison. I'm showing you it right in conclusion of Bosio, who did the Cupid I showed you before in the watercolor, his portrait of Josephine from about 1803. And on the left, a work from about 150 BC, The Lady of the Antonine Court. 150 AD, of a Lady of the Antonine Court. Although deeply inspired by antiquity, the notion itself, by around 1800, had much greater signification than it had in earlier periods, and it embraced both the Mediterranean cosmopolitanism of the old regime and the burgeoning medieval romantic movement associated with Ossian and troubadour visual culture. Private taste and public propaganda merge in Bonapartist patronage in surprising juxtapositions and palpable tensions, and I hope I've shown you some of these. Nowhere is this seen to greater advantage than at Malmaison and in the patronage of Josephine after the divorce in 1809. Thank you.
Our second speaker this morning is Jeffrey Collins, professor of 17th and 18th century studies at the Bard Graduate Center for Studies in the Decorative Arts in New York City. He received his BA in American Studies from Yale University, his MA in Art History as the Paul Mellon Fellow at Clare College at the University of Cambridge, and then returned to Yale to earn his PhD in Art History. He taught for 10 years at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he served as Chair of Art History, Adjunct Associate Professor of French and Italian Studies, and founding director of the annual Art History Seminar in Rome. A Fellow of the American Academy in Rome, he won the Rome Prize in 1996 to work on his book, Papacy and Politics in 18th Century Rome, Pius VI and the Arts. His research has been supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship in the Humanities, the Fulbright Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among numerous other foundations and organizations. He is currently working on a book entitled Marshalling the Muses, the Museo Pio Clementino and the Greek Ideal. This morning, his lecture is entitled From France to America, Transformations of the Empire Style. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Collins.
Thank you very much, Ron, for the invitation to participate today. And thank you, Christopher, for setting up some of the themes that I want to talk about this morning so well. And Ron was too modest to mention this, but he is actually a graduate of the institution where I now teach. So very nice to be here. And thank you all for coming to this morning's seminar. And with your permission, I'd like to start my talk with a quotation that I think embodies the spirit of these two images. Quote, when Napoleon I first came to power in 1799 as first consul of France, he modeled his new regime on ancient Rome. No ruler in the history of the world has been more aware of the capacity of symbolism to propagate power. On state occasions, Napoleon wore regalia copied after that of the Roman emperors. He sat on a throne inspired by a Roman model, and he rewrote the laws of France as the Code Napoleon based on Roman law. But despite his titanic military and political prowess, some of his most lasting and influential achievements were in the decorative arts. And I'm showing you here Napoleon on that throne in a portrait by Ingres and a title page from the ceremonial book of these ornaments at Notre Dame that we heard about from Christopher by his designers Percier and Fontaine. And I would love to claim that little capsule version of the Empire style as my own, but those words are actually the blurb for a new groundbreaking exhibition on Napoleon and the art of the Empire style that I hope maybe some of you had a chance to see in St. Louis or in Boston, and if you hurry up, you can go see it in Paris, where it's up through the 5th of October, and I'm actually taking my own students to Paris to see it in 2 weeks, so I feel very lucky. Now, that show is subtitled Symbols of Power, and I think it really marks the Empire style's coming of age as a field of historical study and also of aesthetic admiration. And I think we'd all agree from these two images alone that this was one of the most accomplished and distinctive periods in French design. That admiration was not always there, and I'd like to contrast this adulatory passage with a quotation from Hugh Honor's book on neoclassicism of 1968, which is still in print and widely read, and it's on the bibliography that I prepared for those of you who want to do some further reading. It's out on the table if you haven't picked it up. And here, maybe I'll change to the feminine side of the empire coin. And here I quote again from Honor. Yet so far from being, as is sometimes supposed, the culmination of the neoclassical movement, the empire marks its rapid decline and transformation back once more into a mere antique revival, drained of all the high-minded ideals and force of conviction that had inspired its masterpieces, by which he means works of the mid to late 18th century. It became a purely decorative style, evocative of imperial luxury and grandeur. The revivalist shell was retained, and the neoclassical kernel was thrown away. That's Honor. Harsh words, but they're not unique, and I think we could find many other examples of explicit scorn for the empire style as outlandish or histrionic or in some other ways polluted by politics. Even a devotee of the period, like Mario Praz, the great Italian scholar, admitted that it was easy to caricature the empire style as cold and stiff, and here I quote, funereally monotonous in its eternal sphinxes, its swans, its goats and lions' feet, and I think we see some of those here, and we'll see a lot more. It was, in sum, to quote Praz, a style for parvenu, with all that bronze gilt ornament on shining, heavy mahogany, that ostentation of richness in its crudest form, gold. And we definitely have a lot of gold here. Now, my purpose in contrasting these two views of the empire style was not to harp on the pendulum of taste, but to suggest that immediately when we study the empire style, questions of aesthetics inevitably get bound up with issues of morality and convictions and changing cultural ideals. Is the empire style art? Or is it ideology? Is it decoration, or is it propaganda? And if it's the latter, what ideology and what propaganda? And I think we've already seen that those terms are somewhat malleable. So we'll come back to those questions in the course of this seminar. There are obviously points on which everyone agrees that the empire style was intimately associated with Napoleon and Josephine, that it marked a break with earlier varieties of classicism, and that it quickly spread its gilded wings to influence much of the Western world. So what I want to do this morning is to examine the style's development, its core principles, and also its transformation as it was nurtured in France and exported perhaps somewhat unpredictably, to America. So by examining a wide range of motifs and media, I hope to trace how some of these empire-style ideas and designs pioneered under Napoleon found new life and new vigor here on these shores in very different cultural and political contexts. So let's start by defining the empire style, which is actually a label that not everyone agrees on, and some historians don't even like to use it. France, as you heard, did not even become an empire until 1804, although the empire-style label is often extended to include the earlier periods of the Directory and the Consulate. Now, the exhibition that I mentioned in Paris actually defines the period of empire as 1800 to 1815, and in preparing this talk, I was shocked to find slides in our image library from the 1780s marked as empire style, which is something that I think Louis XVI would have taken serious exception to. And in fact, Josephine's swan chair that I'm showing you here technically falls in the Consulate. And then, of course, in America, as we'll see, it's really a later phenomenon that only begins in 1815. Now, what everyone agrees on is that the empire style was the last phase of a classical revival that had begun a full 50 years earlier by avant-garde designers whose first foray into a classical idiom was this goût grec, or Greek taste, exemplified in objects like these that I'm showing you here. On the left, a writing table for the connoisseur and art collector Ange Laurent Lalive de Julie of the 1760s, who clearly wanted a kind of masculine alternative to the prevailing feminine Rococo, and I do put that in quotes. And I think in this table alone, you can see that there's a new emphasis on a heroic vocabulary. I hope you can make out the lion's skin here, Hercules' lion skin, the lion paw feet. The whole thing is really conceived of as a building, the legs like architectural columns, here bold, overscaled Greek moldings, an architectural conception as well as a kind of heaviness and weight, and a color scheme of black and gold that is evoking gilt and patinated bronze. Now, the vase on the right has many of those same qualities, that the kind of deep saturated blue as opposed to the lighter blues, turquoise that you might think of as typical 18th century colors, these bold, very similar geometrical ornaments, which are derived in part from ancient pottery, but also from architecture. And there's a sense, almost an overscaled sense of massiveness and weight versus the delicacy of ancient pots, even though this, of course, is executed in fine Sèvres porcelain. And this kind of first phase of antique revival is easy to caricature, and some people really thought they'd gone too far, and I could show you very cartoonish illustrations of Greek-style brides, Greek monks, and even Greek-style architects. So this is not yet the empire style, although we recognize some of the key ingredients. And this had a fairly limited audience among a select slice of connoisseurs. But the next phase of classicism preferred a much more refined, delicate series of elegant forms, like in this writing table by Adam Weisweiler, who really epitomizes what we might call the palace classicism of Louis XVI. And I hope you're seeing the kind of intricate inlays, rather spindly forms, use of light woods, even these little Wedgwood or Wedgwood-style plaques here that really enliven this piece and make it just a triumph of sort of delicate virtuosity. And in some ways, this is a very French and high-style version of what we might think of as federal style in this country. But I include a note that this, of course, belonged to Josephine and was indeed, as we heard this morning, part of Josephine's great admiration, especially after 1809, for the 18th century. So we mustn't see a kind of break between these two phases of the style. She clearly appreciated this early classicism as well, and perhaps in the private context. If we look then at this fauteuil or armchair that was made for Marie Antoinette, not one that Josephine got her hands on, we see that there's the same kind of elegant adaptation of ancient forms really to modern comfort and convenience. And I think you'll see this suggestion of ancient Ionic columns here. But in particular, I wanted to draw your attention to something we might think of as a more empire device. This is these Egyptian-style pharaoh heads, which are a bit of a surprise to find this early, and indicate that the empire really drew extensively on works from the later period of the monarchy. But I think it is nonetheless true that if we juxtapose this chair with a later 19th century version of the same fauteuil form, and this is for Empress Marie-Louise, who replaced Josephine, we see that kind of ratcheting up of the rhetoric that Praz indicated as being characteristic of this later moment, these bolder forms, the richer colors, the dazzling overall gilding, and a move, in a sense, from a kind of distribution of even ornament across the entire piece to these concentrated explosions of decoration in particular parts. So I think this piece really exemplifies what Praz believed is the essence of the Empire style, which is that it is a style that sets out first and foremost to impress. Now, I think that need to impress, really comes largely from the patrons, who are primarily Napoleon and Josephine. Napoleon in particular, who I think we'd all agree really defines the parvenu. And the trajectory, I think, between these two portraits of the man explains something of his evolving taste in the applied arts. Now, in 1800, as we see on the left, Napoleon is really still bursting onto the European scene. He's imagined here in this portrait by David, sort of barreling over the Alps in the tracks of Hannibal and Charlemagne. And I'm sorry, my slide cuts this off, but I hope you can just make out. He has signed his name here, Hannibal, and then down here, Carolus Magnus. So he's clearly marching in a well-blazed trail and wanting to do it more spectacularly, but really insert himself into a very ancient lineage in all the ways that Christopher talked about so beautifully this morning. And this is really the sort of early aspect of Napoleon's propaganda, to kind of physically insert himself into European power politics. And antiquity, as we see, is a tremendously useful model for this. Not the only one, but extremely useful for this public face. Now, by 1812, when the same artist painted the same patron up late, working in the Tuileries Palace on his new Napoleonic code, he's really taken the place of royalty, or as Christopher suggested, he's actually exceeded it, and he needs a new kind of trapping of furnishings that match this new imperial status. And I think you can see some of these in the painting, these lion monopodia on his desk, this overall gilded ornament that looks quite like the throne for Marie-Louise, gilded stars, everywhere, deep, rich colors. And I think Napoleon here, even in this so-called domestic setting, is literally surrounding himself with this kind of validating historical iconography. Now, in painting, as we saw, at least in some of his commissions, he really did champion Jacques-Louis David, as Christopher explained, who had already articulated a new cultural and aesthetic ideal in much earlier works, still before the Revolution, like the seminal painting of the Oath of the Horatii, seen from very ancient Roman history, which is really being phrased, I think, as a kind of a manifesto of a return to new antique notions of morality and heroism and masculine self-determination. This really is a kind of ideological statement. And I will add that this is a work that Thomas Jefferson knew and greatly admired. When it was first shown in the Salon of 1785, of course, it was read as being quite compatible with the defense of monarchy. This is, after all, that period of Roman history. But by the Empire period, I think it was much more widely seen as an imperial statement, despite the slight historical anachronism. Now, this painter, Jacques-Louis David, was also a pioneer in translating these new ideals into the decorative and applied arts. In fact, it was David who commissioned some of the very first proto-empire-style furniture for his painting studio, and he even included some of those in his paintings. There are none here, but I can show you, just instead to evoke this idea, a much later empire-style clock by Claude Gallet of about 1815 that transposes the Horatii into 3 dimensions. And this is exactly the kind of reduction or transposition of earlier ideological classicism into the decorative arts that Hugh Honor ridiculed as a kind of decline or decay. But I think in another way, it really is this heroic spirit of archaeology that Napoleon wanted to capture both for his public and, I would argue, for his private image. And to do that, he turned, as Christopher suggested, to 2 of David's associates, Charles Percier and Pierre-François Léonard Fontaine. And here I'm showing you an ideal view by Percier, a very accomplished draftsman, of a kind of ideal museum. Now, Percier and Fontaine had studied with David in Rome in the late 1780s, where they were nicknamed the 2 Etruscans. They became inseparable and formed a lifelong partnership, both of business and affection. They made a vow never to marry and are actually buried in the same tomb at Père Lachaise. And I think this makes clear that they really absorbed the spirit and the letter of antiquity and arrived back in Paris, poised to put this new language at the service of the state. And I think this ideal museum, which clearly draws on many of the artifacts and museums that Percier and Fontaine had seen and studied and drawn very carefully in Rome, is also a kind of prefiguration of their plans, and certainly of Napoleon's plans for the new Louvre Museum, which, of course, in a slightly later period would soon come to be called the Musée Napoleon. So this is a kind of manifesto for making Paris into a new Rome, and that was exactly Napoleon's own plan. And he exacted, really punishing concessions in the course of his Italian campaign. And as a result of some very punitive treaties, some of Rome's greatest treasures came to Paris by the cartload. These included paintings, manuscripts from the Vatican archives, and then works of sculpture that were really the acknowledged masterpieces of 18th century taste, like the Apollo Belvedere that I'm showing you here that we've seen before. And here I hope you can see it in this Sèvres vase on its sort of triumphal chariot. It's a commemorative vase that, here's the Laocoon behind it, marking its triumphal entrance through the street of Paris, with parade with zoo animals, and is officially entering the Louvre to take its place. And then here on the right, this rather caricaturous aquatint from a little bit later of Napoleon, showing off his conquests at the Louvre to his deputies. And I wonder if there isn't a little element of satire here, because he's doing his very best to look Apollonian, but he somehow is a dwarf version of Apollo. I don't think this was approved iconography, although it gets to the spirit of what he was really doing. And it was indeed Percier and Fontaine, as Christopher showed us, who really transformed Paris into Napoleon's new Rome with neo-Roman structures like this Arc du Carrousel, which was indeed the entrance to his redecorated Tuileries Palace. Or those of you who've been to the Louvre, you know those hypnotic arcades on the Rue de Rivoli, which sort of it looks like an aqueduct or something stretching down to the Place de la Concorde. And that is also, of course, Percier and Fontaine's work. It's a restoration, and you'll notice that this quadriga, which of course is long gone from the ancient models, is lovingly recreated here. Now, both Percier and Fontaine defined themselves as architects, but as we've seen, the pair soon became all-purpose designers, programming everything from Napoleon's new city to his coronation regalia, as I showed you at the very outset, and the chairs that he sat in at home, which were all suitably inspired by antique precedents. And here at lower right, I'm showing you a page from the suite of designs, the Recueil de Décoration Intérieure, that was first published in 1801 and many subsequent editions. And this aesthetic of Percier and Fontaine is obviously rooted in the antiquarian world of 18th century scholars and designers like Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who I show you above, who devoted this sample plate to contrasting in minute detail differences between the Greek and Roman version of the Ionic order in these really meticulous and well-studied line engravings. Now, you see here the Greek version, which Piranesi thinks is rather boring and poor, and then these rich, inventive Roman versions that he clearly prefers. And I think Percier and Fontaine really absorbed this lesson while they were in Rome, and they clearly also prefer a kind of voracious, synthetic classicism, an omnivorous classicism that combines really all available ingredients into useful forms that are both old and new. And I think you can see that even their manner of presenting their designs in the plate below, in these dense but abstracted line drawings, is obviously inspired by the kind of archaeological or antiquarian publications of people like Piranesi. Now, Percier and Fontaine's first great achievement, as we heard, was Malmaison. And in fact, it was Josephine who really discovered the pair and brought them to Napoleon's attention. There was some problem with the outlandish bill that they presented for their first scheme for the redecoration of Malmaison, but it was scaled back, and and they regained the consul's favor. And it was indeed Napoleon who quickly realized and exploited their talent to the full. And here I'm showing you a room that Christopher didn't show us this morning, which is the the consul's council chamber at Malmaison. And remember that Napoleon is still consul here, an explicitly Roman title. So this room is suitably conceived of as a military tent, a kind of temporary installation, as one might make in one of Bonaparte's field campaigns. But there's a kind of slippage, I think, between the modern general and the ancient hero, because the iconography here is really purely Roman. The Roman helmets painted back here on these panels, which are given in more detail up here, and I hope that's reminding you of the gladiator helmet in Josephine's collection that you can study upstairs in the gallery. There are Roman legionary standards here that seem to hold up the tent with this displayed eagle with the wings outspread, sphinxes, griffins, all of that. And then the furniture itself here gives the impression of being very similar to that bronze folding kind of camp furniture. Again, we have examples in the galleries upstairs from the Herculaneum and Pompeii excavations, and those were in fact the very types of things that Napoleon and Josephine would receive within a few years, even months, of the furnishing of this room. And that X-frame or curule form is something I want to draw your attention to, because we'll see it again, as well as these increasingly familiar tables with lion legs, or lion monopodia, meaning a single foot joined to a lion's head. Now, obviously, what distinguishes this room, even if the ingredients are familiar, is the new importance of an overwhelming metaphor, of symbolism, room as tent. And in that sense, the total effect was much more thoroughgoing and really shockingly new and innovative, and I think well suited to the militaristic tenor of this new age. And in fact, martial or military themes really come to permeate French design over the next decade, which are obviously in a general sense a tribute to the emperor's bravery and military prowess. So on the right, I show you the sconces or wall lights that Napoleon added to Louis XIV's Grand Trianon pavilion in the gardens of Versailles. Of course, they take the form of elaborate gilded arrows with, I think, horns here or trumpets. I hope you can make those out, of the type that might be associated with fame that's won on the battlefield. And I think one could even say that the candle arms themselves are sort of modified, bugles or hunting horns. So again, the kind of dominant metaphor that seems to organize this furniture. Or on the left, this magnificent stool that's clearly formed from the concetto or metaphor of crossed military sabers. And this is another design by Percier, here executed by Guillaume Biennet. And I would emphasize that Percier and Fontaine were designers, not craftsmen, and they, of course, subcontracted their designs to specialists who could execute them to the level of quality that Napoleon demanded. And this is a good example of how an idea that starts in Napoleon's circle really then permeates society, because although these stools were conceived specifically for the marshals of France and to be arranged in the throne room around the throne of the emperor, at least one spectator who saw them early on said, as I give you here, that they would look very beautiful for a library or a study. And obviously this is a man's study that we're talking about here. So empire design, then, consistently seems to operate at the level of symbolic reference and metaphor. And in some cases, empire objects even concretize or refer to very specific historical events. And nowhere is this clearer, I think, than in objects that evoke the Egyptomania that really swept France in the wake of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign of the very late 1790s. And here you have a wonderful pair of Egyptian-style coffee cups upstairs in the Malmaison exhibit, which I encourage you to go and see. So, as you may know about this Egyptian campaign, Napoleon took along not just legions of soldiers, but legions of draftsmen, scholars, and archaeologists to document these astonishing antiquities that had long been known, but very little visited. This was really the first time that there was anything like a kind of scientific exploration of Egypt. And imperial designers then were very, very happy to make use of these publications. And in this astonishing metal cabinet that's on the left, again, designed by Percier, following archaeological drawings by Baron Vivant Denon, who was Napoleon's first director of the Louvre Museum. It's obviously conceiving of this piece as an ancient Egyptian temple pylon, complete with a winged solar disk here, and these kind of bound papyrus rods and staves of the pharaoh, and of course the scarab and the sun. And of course the materials also seem to evoke Egypt. They're quite innovative, as well as this lustrous dark mahogany that maybe suggests bronze. It's actually inlaid with silver, which is a new and different technique. And of course the main point is that if one opens this rather tomb-like door, one sees a series of little drawers in which coins and medals, many of them ancient themselves, could be collected. So the metaphor, I think, in an object like this is of permanence and age and a sense of history that's really being embodied. And of course, that is what coins themselves do. If arranged correctly, they narrate history. And I think much of this Egyptomania design is a way to enshrine collecting itself as a kind of major cultural preoccupation. And I think we see collecting of a sort of different kind and perhaps a lower level in this wonderful printed cotton on the right, or this toile de Jouy that collects views, again from Denon, of the various monuments of Egypt into a single repeating pattern that could be stamped on the cotton with a roller, a new industrial technology. And this is I'm showing you just a small snippet. It becomes a kind of repeating pattern that could be used as a furnishing fabric for curtains or upholstery, bed hangings. I suppose you could even use it for costume. And I think you can make out, pyramids, tombs, Egyptian sort of camels, and then an obelisk. And of course, Paris itself was supposed to have an obelisk. Napoleon desperately wanted one, and it did, in the end, receive one, which you'll recognize from the Place de la Concorde, although it took a few decades for it actually to arrive. And I think that a furnishing fabric like this suggests how even Frenchmen of much more modest means, could participate or share in some way in their leaders' military and cultural accomplishments. Now, collecting, of course, is at the heart of the Louvre Atlanta's new exhibitions, and indeed the whole conception. So I want to highlight some of the ways Napoleon's and Josephine's designers drew directly on the imperial couple's private holdings. Now, we know that Percier drew this particular folding stand, or brazier, when he was at Malmaison, and you can see it upstairs in the galleries. And it's this type of object, if not this exact one, that clearly inspired Percier's similar designs for a whole range of household implements. And I give you, again on the right, a very beautifully hand-colored edition of this Recueil de Décoration Intérieure of 1801. And I think you can see that Percier's versions of these are at once much, much more colorful than the originals and also more elaborate. There's a sort of additive aesthetic of taking all of the great storehouse of motifs from antiquity and combining them into one extremely grand object. It's a kind of a collage effect. We can also see, but the key motifs that I want you to recognize are obviously the sort of sinuous animal paw, leg and foot, the animal heads, and the general idea of kind of elegant lightness, but also great solidity. And I think we see those same visual qualities in these South Italian vases, like this Lucanian example on the left that Josephine probably received a bit later, about 1808 or so, from Caroline Murat, which really catalyzed numerous designs for Etruscan ceramics. This one happens to be Italian. Many of these vases are of Greek manufacture, but thought to be Etruscan because Etruscan or Italian tombs were one of the main places that they were found. And this is perhaps a slightly early example, but I think it's one of the best ones, and I'm showing you on the right a design from the archives of the factory at Sèvres, which copies obviously both those ancient Anthemian patterns that are so prominent here on the neck of the vase, as well as the idea of a figural vignette of people in ancient costume and perhaps even a bit of rather empire-looking furniture. So there's a sort of slippage. Are we in antiquity or are we in an elegant drawing room of someone like Josephine? Now here, of course, one doesn't really need a big vase for mixing wine and water, but one does need a teapot. So again, it's been updated for a modern use, and it's executed not in pottery like the example on the left, but an elegant high-fired, hard-paste and glazed porcelain. One more example, this very stately bronze basin that was also owned by Josephine on the left. And I was interested to learn, in fact, that it is actually an 18th century assemblage that was put together by Neapolitan restorers in the mid-18th century before Josephine received it. But this kind of towering, multi-staged form becomes a leitmotif of empire design and really comes to signify antiquity. And it's obviously that kind of device that is inspiring untold numbers of dishes on stands. And I just give you as an example this very elaborate soup tureen by Odio, which is, I think, another example of craftsmen taking the ingredients and the overall form, but significantly enhancing, and I would argue aggrandizing, a fairly simple antique original. So we've seen then some of these design principles underlying the empire style, and before turning to its American manifestation, I just want to march you quickly through a range of objects that illustrate some of these key tendencies, as well as some favored motifs. So first of all, we've talked about metaphor, and empire designers really embraced this trend. Animals were big inspiration, as you see, and this is rather funny. This is an early example where they hadn't quite integrated it. I think it would have been rather disconcerting to have your tea at a table that looks like it's about to walk away. Later examples are rather more modest, just a few little animal feet here and here. This again shows you kind of preference for broad expanses of simple wood and blocky forms, and then these little concentrated doses of ornament in these brass or gilt bronze mounts, but a preference for either solid woods or elegant imported veneers. And think back to the rich, time-consuming inlay of the Louis XVI style that really is being banished here. Now, wings obviously become a dominant motif in empire design, in some cases clearly symbolizing victory, Napoleon's victory over his foes, just like the arch. We see that very obviously in the candelabra at left, which really are miniature antique-style, nikkes or victories, like the victory of Samothrace, that have been domesticated for daily use. Now, animals obviously could also be winged, and this is just a typical empire-style console table, which is also by this maker Bernard Molitor on the right. And it's an example of that daring play of solid and void that empire designers like to exploit. Antique cameos become a favored idea, whether they're actual cameos, as set into this ornamental hair comb on the left, which was made for the wedding of Napoleon's sister to Prince Camillo Borghese, which was another source of the Louvre's magnificent antiquities collection, or again a printed fabric on the right that exploits the idea of cameos or carved intaglio gems that were cut with mythological scenes, and that obviously makes a kind of pleasing small-scale pattern. Now, harps and lyres and other musical instruments permeate empire objects, a reminder that Napoleon's conquests also ushered in an age of relative peace. And lyres, of course, are symbols not just of the arts, but of harmony and proportion, and also good government. So stringed instruments appear in this elegant sugar container here. The lyres on the other side, this looks like some sort of big zither or something. And significantly, even actual musical instruments were redesigned to accord with ancient models. And some of the strangest hybrids, I think, are these empire-style bastards called lyre guitars, which look like something Apollo might have picked up and strummed with the muses. I'm told that they're horrible to play, but they're very fashionable, and you'll see them widely in contemporary female portraiture. Now, equally Apollonian, of course, are the swans that we've already seen and that invaded really every aspect of life under the empire. And again, it's Mario Praz who rather humorously quotes Marcel Proust about, quote, all those things that invade our houses, the sphinxes that come to crouch at the feet of the sofas, the serpents coiled round the candelabra, a huge muse who holds out a little torch, or has quietly climbed onto the mantelpiece and is leaning against your clock. So I think swans are obviously key to this sort of antique menagerie, although their meaning, I think, is a little harder to pin down. They are at once sacred to Apollo, who's the patron of arts and music, but they're also evocative of Venus and are symbols of passion and eroticism. I don't know exactly what the swans mean on this washstand or lavabo, which was designed by Percier for Fontaine, and you have by Percier for Napoleon, and you have Napoleon's own example of this form upstairs in the galleries that accompanied him to exile. I can only assume that in this case they were admired as much for their delicate curving necks, that sort of line of beauty that empire designers love, as well as evoking water. This is a washstand, after all, and we have more water imagery down here in the dolphins And there would have been, of course, a ewer filled with water for washing yourself sitting right down here. Now, in this basket, one of the most magnificent products of the Sèvres manufactory in the 20s, part of an extensive dinner service, the presence of these swans, I think reconfigures the entire table, which might have had a mirrored plateau, as a kind of lake on which the delicacies, are floating towards the diners. And that's, I think, a nice idea. If we turn back to the Empress's chair, we, I think, get closer to an idea of swans as a sign of beauty queen of the natural world. And you'll notice that, just like their occupant, these swans are actually wearing pearl necklaces here. So I think there would have been a wonderful conflation between the lily-white skin, perhaps, of Josephine on this throne and the beautiful white plumage of the swans. And here I just show you one of those clocks where obviously this is Venus and Cupid, and obviously the appropriate furniture for Venus is indeed a swan ended sofa. Now, in Josephine's throne-like bedroom at Malmaison that we've already seen, which was set up just at the moment of divorce from Napoleon, these swans, I think, must have helped console her as she tried to sleep at night, warding off bad dreams and pulling her bateau lit, or boat bed, quietly through the rivers of nightly oblivion. Now, in case we're surprised to encounter so much emphasis on love in empire design, I thought I would just show you this breakfast tray, actually given by Napoleon to the wife of his stepson, Prince Eugène de Beauharnais. And we see it better, I think, maybe in these details, which show the technical perfection that the applied arts reached under imperial patronage. On this coffee pot on the left, you see that Venus has confiscated Cupid's bow. He's clearly been naughty. And the tray itself shows a scene of nymphs actually being brought. They're accused, and they've been brought to defend themselves before love's very own tribunal. And I would love to know what they were accused of, but that is not recorded. The empire style, in other words, was fully open to this kind of lightheartedness or humor when the occasion demanded it, and in the case of wedding gifts, even from the emperor, it clearly did. So we're back to this sort of private-public sphere. And then finally, to clinch the point, I just want to show you another example of this boat bed form, in which the gilt bronze mount tells a rather charming, if enigmatic, story. The poppies are clear enough because they induce sleep, and the butterflies are clearly flocking to their nectar. But there's obviously another subtext, since Cupid here stands on the sidelines with his bow, and a figure who looks like Diana, the chaste huntress with her crescent moon, shoots this poor defenseless moth, a symbol of the soul, as we've heard, but moths could also be symbols of passions that inflame the heart, since they tend to immolate themselves into candle flames. So I wonder if there isn't some discourse of love versus chastity, obviously a kind of a witty thing for a bed. So empire design, then, is by no means the kind of somber, lugubrious, or bombastic style that its detractors sometimes made out. Now, this bed, I think, also allows us to think about the empire body, which was itself reconfigured to suit these new cultural ideals. And you'll see that in these sculptural bronzes there, and also in this new idea of nakedness, or at least a daring state of elegant undress, diaphanous draperies, and a tension between the natural and the statuesque. And those are exactly the qualities that we find in David's famous portrait of Madame Recamier, one of Paris's most elegant hostesses. And she sits here on her neo-antique couch that still survives. You can see it at the Louvre, and I hope you notice also the lamp stand that evokes explicitly the Pompeian models that you can see upstairs. Now, these daring fashions, we'll see it better here, obviously were canonized in these so-called empire waists, these elegant muslin dresses, these high waists that dominate female silhouette. And here you have Madame Talleyrand as painted by Gérard. And then on the right, two actual empire-style dresses. And these have an interesting story because they were supposedly worn by a Baltimore beauty who actually married another of Napoleon's endless brothers. And Napoleon was furious about this and quickly had the marriage annulled. And one of the commentators at this wedding said it was quite shocking that the bride wore a wedding dress so small that if bundled up it would fit in his pocket. So this was a bit shocking. Now, men also were redesigned at this period, and here on the left is David's early idea for a new national costume for judges very soon after the Revolution, part of a comprehensive redesign of civil uniforms to mark a break with the monarchic past and recreate, something like a Roman republic. And it's a bit silly and obviously didn't catch on. And after Napoleon's coronation, male dress quickly reverted back to established norms. And I show you here the costume of a Danish ambassador at Napoleon's coronation. Now, Danes, of course, were not the only ones who traveled to Napoleon's France among the foreigners, and in the rest of the seminar, I want to turn to the ways that the empire design reached American shores and then what influence it had at a period of unprecedented change in the American material and visual environment. And I want to start with this image of a Parisian salon that was sketched by the American Robert Gilmore of Baltimore during what was actually his second European trip in 1818. And I hope that date immediately signals to you a lag of the popularity of the style between France and its transference across the Atlantic. And there were good reasons for this. Wars simply made it unsafe to travel during much of the Napoleonic period, and naval blockades of American ports by both France and England, especially during the War of 1812 to 14, managed to both close off America and really stoke anti-British sentiment. They burned the White House, after all. So when this war ended, Americans were newly interested in French fashions, in French way of living, and they flocked to the continent as a way of really stating their cultural and political loyalties against Britain. And Gilmore, I think, is clearly, deeply impressed by what he saw, and he records in a rather meticulous fashion, new fashions in lamps, clocks of the type we've seen, pier mirrors, heavy swag draperies, these kind of elegant columnar center tables, as well as obviously the high empire waists, the musical instruments, harps, lyres, the whole accoutrement of the art de vivre as it had been really canonized in Paris. And in these next decades, after 1814, newly wealthy Americans, especially merchants from the port cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, really struggled to emulate the kinds of things that they had either seen in person or read about or heard about in Europe. So one might even say that after a revolution in the political sphere, America experienced another revolution in the material sphere and in the very idea of the home. I think we get an idea of this revolution in this painting by Henry Sargent called The Dinner Party, which is really a kind of icon of the fashionable settings, the accoutrement, and the really new idea in American design of a room that was reserved just for dining. This had not existed in the colonial period. And obviously here this room is endowed with classical proportions, an empire chandelier, these swag draperies, some of the things we saw in the Gilmore sketch. This type of new elegance, and this is obviously a gentleman's party, after the tablecloth has been removed, the women have withdrawn to the drawing room and they're about to start smoking. And in this new space, new specialized furniture forms arose that were, again, unprecedented in the colonial period. And these new forms included, in these details of Sargent, this cellaret or wine cooler that I show you on the left, and then this sideboard, something we're familiar with today, but this is one of the first periods that this furniture form ever darkened American doorways. And you can see here perhaps a proto-empire style water pitcher and then one of those lamps exactly of the type that Gilmore had sketched. Now this one is still rather dainty in the older neoclassical style with these tapered legs and bowed front. And I just juxtapose it to the magnificent example in the High's own collection by William Whitehead, which shows all of this inlay. This sort of embodies the earlier neoclassical form that we associate in America, at least with the 1790s. But this sideboard form would quickly change to a more characteristic empire form, as in this example by Duncan Fife. And the metaphor here is, again, as we've seen in the French examples, it's architecture. It's a columnar building where the forms reach to the ground with a sense of weight and gravity. And you'll notice, of course, the carved and gilded feet, which are taking the place of the elaborate ormolu and gilt bronze mounts in the French examples. Now, the cellaret or wine cooler has assumed the shape of a kind of a cinerary urn or even a sarcophagus. And the fullest expression, that became a kind of nickname for these things. And I think the fullest expression of this motif is this sarcophagus-shaped cellaret that is just, it's loaded with metaphor. The whole thing is a metaphor. And I've actually written and studied this object in some detail, and I had great fun thinking about how the designers and the patrons are clearly playing with the idea of drunkenness as a form of sleep. Sleep as a form of death. You know, we talk about being dead drunk or falling down drunk or putting a pet to sleep. So there's a whole slippage of death and sleep. It's an old idea, and it's being worked out here, I think, in a way that is an early version of the death in the dining room theme, that if you go into the galleries and look at a later 19th century sideboard with the dying stag. You know, you'll get a sense of it. It's a sophisticated taste. This did not appeal to everyone. Not everyone wants a tomb by their table. And this was owned by a New York merchant, Stephen Ball Munn, who was furnishing a new house on Broadway in 1814. He made a fortune during the War of 1812. And of course, in designing his townhouse, he chose French Empire models, explicitly not British ones. So Munn, in a sense, is an early adapter of the French Empire fashions that became fashionable in the 1820s. And we see this again in Sargent's Tea Party, which is a pendant. Exhibition pieces that actually traveled and sort of gave people messages about how they were supposed to furnish their homes. And in fact, this probably shows a whole series of imported objects, and I've given you some examples. This is basically a quotation of Josephine's chairs that we saw at Malmaison. Here's that round table. Here, the kind of winged Victory. You know, every aspect in the Empire waist, of course, and the curule stool. So it's a wholesale importation of new decorative ideas. And these were not just ideals. Real families in America actually commissioned entire suites of furniture, like this one at the Hampton near Baltimore, which was commissioned by John and Eliza Ridgely, by John and Hugh Finley, who were Irish ornamental painters. And Finley was back in Paris significantly in the 18 teens after the war to renew his sense of style and fashion, better to market it in the U.S. And I think you see already the kind of swans and animal feet and elaborate gilding that was, again, unprecedented in American design before this. It's significant that the Finleys were immigrants because it was immigrant craftsmen who really took the lead in offering these new fashions to American clients. And the best of the bunch is the man I'm showing you on the left, who is Charles-Honoré Lannuyer, an ébéniste from France, really fully trained in the Parisian tradition. And you have a wonderful card table upstairs in your galleries that's very similar to the one on the left with these winged caryatids. And this really becomes a New York City specialty. It's a very New York taste. Now, Lannuyer is the best of the best, but they're obviously local imitators. And on the right, I'm showing you clearly an American-made example by an American-born craftsman with this, again, these motifs of the swans. And it's rather cute because this combines swans into a lyre. So it's a sort of double citation, exuberant beyond the original. It's also a bit dense and clumsy, and I think you can see that there's some stenciling here that's taking the place of these elaborate mounts. It's a sort of cheaper alternative, perhaps labor-intensive, but not as much reliant on imported materials. Now, all of these symbols we've seen before in the French context, and I think we should at least ask ourselves, what do they mean here in America? Do they mean the same thing as they would mean in Paris? Is this eagle a symbol of the ancient Roman Empire, or is it the symbol of the new American Republic? There's some evidence that the eagle with the wings outspread was taken early on as a sign of congressional power. Stars here on its waistband, are these like the stars in the American flag? Swans, you know, I can't offer you an explanation for the swans, but I think lyre, good government, harmony, does signal the restoration of peace after the war with the British, and in particular these cornucopias, overflowing with the produce of the land, become a leitmotif in American empire design in a way that they were not in Scotland. And we just have to remember, this of course is the period after the Louisiana Purchase, when there's a tremendous sense of optimism for the agricultural wealth of the country. Duncan Fife, too, a Scottish immigrant, we think of more in the federal version of classicism, but he adopts gradually aspects of empire style, starting to think of his furniture as sculpture at first with a couple of feet and perhaps adding an empire lyre to a sort of Sheraton model. But eventually he rethinks the entire chair as a kind of curule or X-shaped Roman form. And I think this is just the one where fantasy runs wild. It's seen by some scholars as sort of neo-Egyptian. We could trace all the ornaments back to Percier and Fontaine, but I think this has a kind of American native vigor this is Jacksonian America. You know, these are captains of commerce and industry who are really ready to take on the world. And sitting in a chair like that, you would certainly feel able to take on all comers. Even in sofas, where the notional idea is of comfort, they become sculptures. I think it would be very hard to look real relaxed on this bad boy. And it's an assemblage of parts that were really put together from pattern books into a completely American synthesis. And I think we have to go back now to Proust, who describes an interesting interchange. Let me quote to you. "They're not very comfortable to sit in, those empire chairs," the princess ventured. No, the Duchess agreed, but I like being uncomfortable on those mahogany seats covered with ruby velvet or green silk. I like that discomfort of the warrior who understands nothing but the curule chair and in the middle of his principal drawing room crosses his fasces and piles his laurels. And I think that Duchess would be right at home here in this couch. All right, we've encountered some travelers, some immigrant craftsmen, and to conclude, I just want to ask about how other people got information about the wonders of the empire style and made their own homegrown versions. Fashion plates, obviously a key vector for the transmission of the empire waist. And here's a wonderful hat that I hope is evoking the laurel crown that we saw in Napoleon's coronation portrait. These fashion books often alternated between dresses and furniture. You could find both in the same pages, and here's an important one by a Parisian craftsman that was obviously very influential on people like Lanouillet. French emigres actually were an important vector of transmission, and here none more important than Napoleon's older brother Joseph, the former king of Naples and even of Spain, who ends up ultimately in Bordentown, New Jersey, at an estate called Point Breeze, which you see on the top, and then importing magnificent, palace-level objects that really knocked the socks off of local people. So to find palace taste, in Bordentown was amazing. And it set up a kind of market for craftsmen like Lanouillet. And I think you can see that at this level, he's not shy of what they were doing in Paris at all with the finest imported mounts of the type that you see from a shop recovered in an attic and obviously never used. Now, as we've seen, local imitators clearly pick up on this, and they tried to imitate the look of that bronze in gilt stenciling, a New York product. There are local imitations of imported objects. David Sears of Boston was furnishing an elegant townhouse and instructed his agent to buy 2 vases in Paris for a particular niche in his house, and I think you can see a heavy mythological theme, probably Alexander at the tent of Darius. American manufacturers, trying to imitate this, did their very best. Base is a little wobbly, as you can see. And instead of mythology, they foreground the new Philadelphia waterworks. So you see there's a kind of national pride operating here, and a kind of attempt to show that we can take the style and really make it our own. But it's really in silver, I think, which is where I want to conclude, that the empire style really takes off. Silver, of course, being an aspect of how the table itself becomes a locus of display in a way that simply wasn't possible at earlier periods of American history. It's a reflection of the malleability of silver, but also of the much greater wealth that American patrons had. If you think of Paul Revere silver, it's elegant, but it's delicate. It's rather thin. It's a way of stretching silver to cover the most ground with a minimum of metal. Objects like this by the German-born silversmith Anthony Rash are ways of cramming as much heavy silver onto your table as possible. And visitors to these newly fashionable houses in New York and Philadelphia commented that the forks were so heavy they could barely lift them to their mouths. So there's a kind of brash display, and I think you'll recognize, again, the designs of this. Rash is typical of a European craftsman who's almost becomes a kind of migrant, born in Bavaria, moves to Hamburg, then Philadelphia, then New Orleans, and ends up in Demopolis, Alabama, offering clientele this incredibly sophisticated empire style. Even humble objects around the house could acquire this sort of sculptural grandeur. And I wonder in this inkstand here, based on sphinxes, if Harvey Lewis hasn't given a kind of Native American headdress, again, to Americanize in some way an imported design. But it's in presentation pieces that I think we see the culmination of American empire. So I want to leave you with 2 examples that really I think are the ultimate manifestation of the American version of the empire style, and were carefully studied on European models. This is one of a pair of presentation vases that weigh over 80 pounds, commissioned by a series of New York merchants to Governor DeWitt Clinton to celebrate the opening of the Erie Canal. Now they're modeled, I think, as you can see, on an ancient vase of the type that was pioneered by Piranesi, but Americanized with the eagle, and here in particular, the bear skin, I hope you can make that out, and scenes, again, not of mythology, but of the opening of the Erie Canal, which was the result of this commission. And so American objects like this are operating on 2 spheres. I show you this other one here, the local, the vernacular, right? And then also the kind of ideal and the metaphorical, here an idealized vision of history or commerce, you know, in that allegorical sense that would look absolutely at home in Europe. And I'll end then by showing you the most magnificent presentation piece probably ever made in the American Empire period for, again, the merchant class that had become the guardians of this new American wealth. Now, this one was presented to the mayor of New York for the help in ending some financial panic or run on the banks. And if this rings a bell for anyone who reads today's headlines, I hope it should. America, in sum, at this period was really beginning and becoming another kind of empire, not of consuls and thrones, not of coronation regalia, but of shopkeepers and merchants and Wall Street tycoons who made the upstart nation a force to be reckoned with. And they wanted a style commensurate with their expanded horizons and ambitions. And as you can see here, they thought of themselves as heirs not just of the Roman Empire, but even of the Egyptian pharaohs with their Sphinx guardians. It's the same kind of creative, even over-the-top eclecticism that had been pioneered by Percier and Fontaine. I like to think of this as sort of Donald Trump taste. It might have been even better if gilded. America's own Gilded Age wouldn't come in for another generation, but objects like this, I think, really point to America's imperial destiny. Now, Praz, we remember, defined the empire style as ideal for parvenus, and I wonder if today's hedge fund managers are privately redecorating their apartments on Fifth Avenue or Sutton Place in a modern empire style. And in one case I know, I can actually be confident that that is indeed what's happening. I will not name names. So we began, I think, by wondering what on earth the empire style, this ultimate French taste, has to do with America, and I think the answer is everything. So if the empire style is indeed suited to parvenus, then maybe that explains why it took root in a nation that was itself the ultimate arriviste. So I think this one magnificent trophy exemplifies both the differences between the French and the American empire styles, but also reminds us of the continuities of how innovations that were pioneered in Josephine's circle at Malmaison really resulted in this archetype of American empire design. So I will end by reiterating that I called my talk From France to America not just to trace a specific vector in the geographical expansion of taste, but I wanted to draw attention to the remarkable objects that have themselves traveled from France to America as part of the Haas collaboration with the Louvre. At the very least, I hope today's seminar has added a new dimension to the two exhibitions upstairs, and that we will be prepared to go and look at them again today with Franco-American eyes. So I'll leave you there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I think we have a few minutes, right, Virginia, for maybe 10 minutes for any questions. And so, Christopher, I invite you to come take the stage and take any questions. If you would please raise your hand. We have a roving mic, and we'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments. I mean, there was a lot to think about. I mean, it was wonderful. These two lectures really dovetailed together, and issues of public versus private, and masculine versus feminine sensibility, patronage and politics, symbolism and metaphor. Between the two of you, you were able to cover quite a large range of material. Well, let me think if I have a question.
Let me add one thing to complicate slightly the picture. In the interest of time, I left out something that those of you who really want to go on and understand the American version of the empire style should probably be more aware of than I indicated in my talk, which is that in many cases the transmission of these ideas was not direct from France to America, but it often did come by way of England. So that is, in a sense, the missing part of the picture. And many of these designers in America were getting, in some ways, versions of French style that were already slightly watered down by passage through London. So if you're familiar with designers like Thomas Hope or George Smith, this is one way they're also getting this information. So perhaps I drew it a bit too black and white. So the question was whether this geographical path, let's say from France to eastern cities like Baltimore, was at least in part due to exiles or refugees like the Huguenots. And that has always been a really important way that French ideas did leave France, and that French court styles in some ways, migrated abroad. I think to talk about the Huguenots in particular is a little bit too early in this case, since they were chased out definitively in 1685 by Louis XIV in one of his really most boneheaded decisions that really deeply impoverished French design to the benefit of Hampton Court, and the Netherlands. But the idea that French patterns would come abroad through migrating craftsmen searching for better opportunities, whether religious or political, that definitely remains a force. And Baltimore, I think precisely because it was the fastest growing American city, was also among the most welcoming to immigrants and eager to import, in particular, continental talent.
You showed examples from Boston and New York. Was there any evidence that the Empire style influenced the southern cities like Charleston and New Orleans and Savannah as well?
Yeah, very much so. And if I'd had more time or had focused just on the American Empire style, it would have been quite interesting to do a comparison of the regional, variations in this idiom, because it becomes quite distinctive in each city. Each city's merchant class, in a sense, acquires a sort of different personality in what they adopt. And if you go upstairs into the galleries, you'll see a Boston version of one of those Empire sofas of the type I showed you in New York, very brash one. The Boston one is much more sedate, much more restrained. There's relatively little high-style furniture like this gets produced in the South, but New York, including Lanouillet and some of these manufacturers, have a very active very, very active export trade. So they're sending shiploads of this stuff to southern plantations. And in fact, the new Lanouillet discoveries are coming in places like Cuba, where we're finding really important pieces. So Charleston, of course, Christopher, you probably know more about Charleston style than I do.
Well, it helps to make the point of the filtering of French Empire through Britain, because in addition to importing furniture, especially from New York and Philadelphia, a lot of Charleston furniture in particular is imported directly from Britain. And that's especially true up until about the 1820s, when various embargo protectionist legislation in Congress passed through the influence of American manufacturers made the British product, the imports, almost prohibitively expensive. But a lot of people in Charleston were so rich it was a sign of ostentation to actually import it at twice the price, and sometimes not even the same quality. Yeah. But I always think, and correct me, that it is the British influence in Charlestonian things that is stronger than the French. And again, there's Empire style, but it's deeply filtered through British models.
Whereas in Baltimore, if you notice the suite of furniture with the swans, the Finley furniture, Baltimore developed a real taste for painted versions of Empire furniture, and that's something also that comes very specifically from a British context, whereas New York was identified with French taste.
Well, do you think that Baltimore is particularly susceptible to this earlier on than most American cities because the elite there was Roman Catholic, and there was more of a cultural connection to France than to Britain and Maryland?
Are there any other questions? Oh, there's one more over here.
I think the microphone is coming your way.
You mentioned the white muslin dress that was that dress in the Boston show? Was that from that catalog?
No, that's in the Met's collection. The show that was in Boston featured only French material.
Was that, so that is not the dress that the lady wore, the sister-in-law?
Well, that was the provenance that came with it at the time it was donated, but new research has suggested that and I'm not an expert on this embroidery, that embroidery is actually from a year later than the marriage, so that's clearly the type of dress that was worn, and it was unprecedented and very scandalous. There are all sorts of remarks you can read about how Empire style, women were always catching cold. They had almost nothing on.
Thank you.
Although we mustn't, the one thing they wanted to give the idea that they were completely unstructured without any foundation garments, and that's not true. They were wearing corsets. They were wearing a different style of corset that allowed more movement. It's not the rigidly boned one, but they are not au naturel under that muslin.
But there is one exception to that, and that is David's portrait of his wife that's in the National Gallery in Washington.
In a very private context.
In a very private context, which actually shows the nipples through the gauze. Yeah. I mean, very clearly.
We have time for one more question.
Gentlemen, both of you have excluded the Regency period in England, haven't you? Okay.
As I mentioned.
Now, to escape the guillotine, a lot of those French people immigrated to Britain, you know, and brought a lot of stuff with them. I know from my Jane Austen. And, and of course, the Regency equates then with the federal period, doesn't not, sort of?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's precisely what I wanted to point out, that I was being a little bit naughty and excluding the British point of contact, and to remedy that a little bit, I did give you on the bibliography, if you're interested, the exhibition catalog of a show that my institution, the Bard Graduate Center, is opening in July on Thomas Hope, who is himself the heir of a Dutch banking fortune, comes to Britain, and is actually the first person, I believe, to use the words interior decoration in English in his 1807 household taste in interior decoration. And he is a main conduit for this heavy Egyptianizing Regency version of the Empire style. So don't forget about Britain, and I thank you for that supplement.
Well, thank you very much. It's noon, and so I think what a wonderful morning, and I hope that you will have an opportunity to see the exhibitions, if you haven't already, with a newly informed eye. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ron, again for the invitation.